Tonight, a fleet of Russian warships are on our doorsteps, sailing in Cuban waters. Cuba, as you know, is a mere stone's throw, 93 miles from Key West, Florida. Two of the Russian vessels are capable of carrying the Russian hypersonic nuclear missile called the Zircon. The Zircon missile worries the West, as it is not vulnerable to even our best defense systems, such as the Patriot defense system. Local reports were that a trio of Russian Navy ships and a nuclear-powered submarine sailed south past the Florida coastline and Cape Canaveral, headed to Cuba. At one point, the Russian ships sailed within 30 miles of Florida's coast. The fleet includes a Russian frigate called Admiral Gorshkov, a fleet oil tanker, Pashin, a rescued tug, Nikolai Chaiker, and the nuclear-powered submarine, the Kazan. Before arriving in Cuba, the Kazan and Gorshkov conducted missile drills in the Atlantic Ocean. According to Reuters, the drills involved firing high-precision missiles. The missiles were fired at mock enemy targets from a distance of more than 370 miles. To put that distance in perspective, that's about 4 times the distance that currently exists between Key West and Havana, Cuba, where those ships are now. Russia's warships will be in Cuba until Monday. Next, though, the ships are expected to hold air and naval exercises in the Caribbean. As you watch the video at the outset showing the Russian vessels making their way into Havana, many of you might have thought about the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. That crisis erupted after an American U-2 spy plane photographed nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union in Cuba. The world feared at the time that we were on the brink of a nuclear war. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of the island of Cuba to deter the Soviet Union. 6 days later, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev capitulated and withdrew from Cuba, provided the United States agreed to never invade Cuba and to disband its own missile sites in Turkey. So what's happening now? Cuba is saying that this arrival of Russian vessels is standard practice from countries friendly to Havana. Cuba also said the Russian ships carried no nuclear weapons and the visit is for peaceful purposes. According to Reuters, the Biden administration likewise says it does not see the Russian vessels so close to our shores as threatening. But of course, the United States is carefully monitoring the Russian exercises. Former U.S. National Security Advisor and former Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, joins me. Good evening, sir. And Putin putting these Russian vessels in Cuba, it's obnoxious, dangerous, potentially provocative. They're not armed with nuclear weapons. So what's he gained from this?
Well, I think he's sending several messages. First, he knows the G7 leaders are about to meet in Italy, and one of their major topics of conversation is Western aid to Ukraine, which the Russians invaded 2 years ago, 2 years plus. And so I think, as they used to say in the Cold War, this is no coincidence, comrade, that these Russian ships have arrived at Havana. And you rightly started with the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the key elements under which that crisis was ended in the agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev was that the Russians, the Soviets then, would pull out all offensive missiles and offensive capabilities and would not again base such capabilities in Cuba. Now, they've tested that on several occasions since then, including 8 years later, again in the middle of a U.S. election in the fall of 1970 by putting a naval base together for submarines in Cuba at a place called Cienfuegos. Now, whether they're going to do that here, whether these maneuvers in the Caribbean will be more, whether they'll go to Venezuela, obviously all of that we don't know. But I think this is very deliberately the Kremlin saying, we still play in your backyard.
But the irony of it is, look, I get what's going on in the world and everything, and I know this is serious, but the idea to spend the money and the time and to rattle the cage or saber rattle against the United States to send these vessels over there, they're not armed with nuclear weapons. It's meant to sort of poke a stick in the eye of the United States. I mean, the idea that the time is wasted on that and the money is wasted on that, it's just at some point you'd think somebody would say enough is enough.
Well, I think what the Russians are trying to do here is show weakness on the part of the United States, and that helps Putin domestically to show he's sticking up for Russia. It reminds the Europeans that the two big players here, the two nuclear powers with the most at stake in Ukraine, are Russia and the United States. And it reminds us of the risk, the continuing risk of the post-Castro regime in Cuba. And let's not forget Nicaragua and Venezuela. It'd be very interesting if these Russian ships do a little tour of the Caribbean. So, yes, it's political signaling. I mean, I don't know whether they have nuclear weapons or not. They may, and
well,
they're
they
just
say
not
not.
saying
They say,
do. Yeah.
well, they say not in the United States, and I mean, for what the United States, says they do not either. I mean, I don't know who's telling you the truth anymore. But go ahead.
Right. Well, I wouldn't take it on the Russians say so. That's for sure. But this sort of political probing is intended to see what our reaction is. I expect the Biden administration won't do much, and I think that's a mistake. We've got a lot of turmoil in this hemisphere. You've got leftist regimes in Colombia, Brazil. You've got the Chinese interested in making investments in natural resources all over the hemisphere. And this is literally in our backyard. So I don't think the Russians at this point have the wherewithal to keep this up, but the Chinese may. And this new axis that's being formed between China and Russia, the next thing we'll see is joint Russian-Chinese naval maneuvers in the Caribbean.
Ambassador John Bolton, thank you, sir.